somewhere under the sand of southern Iraq tonight, there are clay tablets nobody has read in 4,000 years. Not lost exactly, just waiting. And here's the question I want to put in your mind before you drift off. Who were the Anunnaki, really? Not the version from the internet. The real ones. Because a group of gods with that name genuinely existed in the imagination of the oldest civilization we know of, and people wrote about them, argued about them, feared them, and left us their names pressed into mud. So why does almost nobody know what those tablets actually say? What did the Sumerians believe was decided in that assembly of gods? And how did a word that meant something as gentle as the children of heaven end up, 5,000 years later, on the cover of paperbacks about spaceships? Subscribe and let's get started. We're going to find out. Slowly. Over the next couple of hours, we'll go through 100 things that are actually known about the Anunnaki. The names, the tablets, the excavations, the arguments, the mistranslations, the whole long, strange story of how a Bronze Age idea traveled into the 21st century and got turned into something its inventors would not recognize. And I want to say this now, at the beginning, so you don't feel like you have to keep up. You don't. This is not a test. If you drift off somewhere in the middle of Babylon, that's perfectly fine. The story will still be here. The tablets have waited 4,000 years. They can wait for you, so let yourself get comfortable. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears. There's no rush at all in what follows. Let's begin where the word begins. The first thing worth knowing is that Anunnaki is not a mysterious word. It's not a code, and it's not untranslatable. It's Sumerian, and it comes apart in your hands like a piece of bread. The pieces are roughly a nunna, with nun being the ordinary Sumerian word for prince or noble, and a carrying the sense of seed, or offspring, or lineage. So, Annuna means something close to the princely offspring, or those of noble seed. And when you see the longer form, Anunnaki, that final bit is a grammatical ending, a genitive, the equivalent of our little word of, Anunnaki, Anunna of An, the offspring of An, the sky. Sit with that for a moment, because it explains almost everything that came later. The name of these gods means, more or less, the children of heaven. And when somebody in the 20th century wanted to argue that they came from the sky in ships, that name was sitting right there, waiting to be used. It was practically an invitation. But to a Sumerian, saying the Anunnaki were the children of heaven was about as startling as saying a duke is the child of a king. It was a statement about rank, about family, not about travel. That's our first piece of the puzzle. The second is that these gods were not marginal. They were not a secret cult or a footnote in one obscure text. The word turns up across roughly 2,000 years of writing, in Sumerian and then in Akkadian, in hymns and legal documents and royal inscriptions and curses and prayers. When a Babylonian king wanted to threaten anyone who might deface his monument, he called on the Anunnaki. When a Sumerian priest wanted to describe the moment the universe was organized, the Anunnaki were in the room. They were the establishment. They were, if you like, the divine parliament. And here's the third thing, which surprises people. Nobody in the ancient world seems to have written down a firm number of them. You'd think the gods would be countable. In one text, there are 7 of them. In another, 50. In the great Babylonian creation epic, there are 600, split neatly into 2 groups of 300. In the myth of Inanna's descent, There are exactly 7 Anunnaki sitting as judges in the underworld, and their eyes are described as the eyes of death. 7, 50, 600. The number floats, which tells you something important about how these people thought. The Anunnaki weren't a fixed roster like the 12 Olympians. The word functioned more like a collective, like saying the lords, like saying the court. You didn't need to know exactly how many nobles were in the hall to know you were standing in front of them. Now, here's where we should slow down, because to understand these gods, you have to understand the people who imagined them, and the people who imagined them are, in a real sense, the reason you and I can do anything at all with written words. The fourth thing to know is that the Sumerians invented writing, not the alphabet. That came much later, from the Levant. But writing itself, the technology of freezing speech in a physical object, appears in southern Mesopotamia sometime around 3,400 to 3,200 BCE, in a city called Uruk, and it did not begin with poetry or prayer or the names of gods. It began with accounting. The earliest tablets are receipts: barley, sheep, beer, textiles, jars of oil. Somebody needed to remember who owed what, and somebody pressed a reed stylus into a slab of river clay and made a mark, and the whole edifice of recorded human history followed from that one bureaucratic annoyance. Think about that for a second. Every book you've ever read, every letter, every message on your phone tonight, the deep root of all of it is a man in a mud brick storeroom trying to keep track of grain. The fifth thing, and this one I find quietly moving, is that because of this, the oldest personal name we can read in human history probably belongs to an accountant. On a tablet from Uruk, dating to somewhere around 3100 BCE, there is a record of a very large quantity of barley, dispersed over 37 months, and beside it a sign that reads Kushim. Scholars have gone back and forth about whether Kushim is a person or a job title. That argument is genuinely unsettled, but the most common reading is that it's a name, a man, possibly a brewery administrator, not a king, not a hero, not a prophet, a middle manager. And if that's right, then the first human being whose name survives out of the deep silence of prehistory is someone doing paperwork about beer. There's something wonderfully human in that, isn't there? Let that settle over you. The sixth thing is about the writing itself, because you have to picture it correctly. Cuneiform is not a set of pictures scratched onto stone. It's wedges. The word comes from the Latin cuneus, a wedge, and it describes what happens when you press the corner of a cut reed into soft clay. You get a little triangular impression with a tail. Combine 3 or 4 or 10 of those wedges in patterns, and you have a sign. Combine signs, and you have language. The clay was cheap, the reeds grew everywhere in the marshes, and the resulting tablets, when they dried, were nearly indestructible. Paper burns, papyrus rots. Clay, when a city burns down around it, actually gets harder. It bakes, which means that the great disasters of Mesopotamian history, the sackings, the fires, the collapses, are precisely the reason we can read their literature today. The libraries survived because they were destroyed. Sit with that. It's one of the strangest gifts the past has ever given us. The seventh thing is the geography, and it matters more than you'd think. Sumer sat at the bottom of the great river plain, where the Tigris and Euphrates come down through what is now Iraq toward the Gulf. It was flat, hot, and fertile if you irrigated it, and almost completely without natural resources. No stone worth building with, no timber, no metal ore. Everything hard and permanent had to be imported, sometimes from hundreds of miles away. What they had was mud, water, reeds, and each other, so they built a civilization out of mud. Mud brick houses, mud brick temples, mud tablets, mud walls. And when a mud brick building falls down, you don't clear the site. You flatten the rubble and build on top of it. Do that for 3,000 years, and your city slowly rises above the plain on a hill made of its own former self. Those hills are called tells, and they're scattered across Iraq and Syria today like enormous low tables. Every one of them is a compressed stack of centuries. The eighth thing is that these people were not a nation. Sumer was never a single unified country in the way we'd think of one. It was a constellation of city-states, each with its walls and its fields and its patron god. Uruk, Ur, Eridu, Lagash, Umma, Nippur, Kish, Larsa, Sippar. They traded, they intermarried, and they fought each other bitterly over water rights and boundary canals for 1,000 years. One of the oldest recorded international disputes in human history is a border quarrel between Lagash and Umma over a strip of irrigated farmland called the Guadena, which dragged on and off for something like 150 years. Not a war over gods or glory. A war over a field and a ditch. The ninth thing to understand, and this is where the Anunnaki really come into focus, is that the temple was not a church. We use the word temple and picture a building where you go to worship on a particular day. That's not what these were at all. A Mesopotamian temple was the largest landowner, the largest employer, and the largest bank in the city. It owned fields and herds. It ran workshops. It lent out silver and grain at interest. It employed brewers, weavers, bakers, scribes, singers, gardeners, and fishermen. Hundreds of people, sometimes thousands. And at the center of that enormous economic machine, in a small dark room, there was a statue. The god lived in the statue. Not symbolically, literally in the understanding of the time. The statue was washed and dressed and perfumed. It was given meals, twice a day, real food on real tables, with musicians playing while it ate. It had a bedroom. It had a staff. On festival days, it went out to visit the statues of other gods in other cities, traveling by boat down the canals, and enormous crowds turned out to watch it go by. So when we say the Anunnaki were gods, don't picture something distant and abstract, off in the clouds. Picture a household. Picture a very large, very demanding family, living in the middle of town, whose servants you were, and whose moods determined whether it rained. The 10th thing is the ziggurat, which everybody has seen a picture of and almost everybody misunderstands. A ziggurat is not a pyramid, and there's no tomb inside it. It's solid. A stepped platform of mud brick with a small shrine on the top, built to raise the sacred space up out of the flat river plain. The most famous one still standing, at Ur, was built around 2100 BCE by a king named Ur-Nammu, and its lowest terrace is still there today, reconstructed in places, sitting in the desert of Dekar province. You can stand on the steps. American soldiers stationed at the nearby airbase used to be taken on tours of it. 4,000 years of history, and there's a chain-link fence at the edge of the parking area. The Sumerian word for one of these towers translates roughly as the bond between heaven and earth. That's the whole architectural theory in a single phrase. A staircase for a god, so that when the divine came down to visit the city, there was somewhere for it to land. And that phrase, the bond between heaven and earth, is going to matter later in our story. Remember it. Or don't, I'll remind you. Now, let's meet the family. The 11th thing to know is that at the very top sat An, sometimes written Anu in the later Akkadian form, and An was the sky, not the god who lived in the sky. The sky. In Sumerian, the same sign means heaven, God, and An. And when scribes wanted to indicate that the next word was the name of a deity, they put that little star-shaped sign in front of it as a silent marker. So every single time a Sumerian wrote the name of any god at all, they were writing the sign for "and first." He was baked into the grammar. And yet, and this is the interesting part, and barely does anything, he's the father, the ultimate source of authority, the one whose word cannot be questioned. But in the myths, he's remote, elderly, faintly passive. He delegates. He presides. He rarely acts. There's a pattern here that turns up in a lot of ancient religions. The highest god is often the least active one, like a founder who's moved upstairs to the board and no longer comes to meetings. His temple was at Uruk, a complex called the Inana, the House of Heaven, which he shared with a much more energetic deity we'll get to shortly. The 12th thing is that An's partner was Ki, and Ki was the earth. Just that. Heaven and earth. An and Ki. And in the oldest cosmology, the two of them were originally fused together in a single, undifferentiated mass, and had to be separated before anything could exist. Something had to prise them apart to make room for the world. That prizing apart is where the Anunnaki come from. They are the children of that separation. Heaven above, earth below, and in the space between, the space where we live, where the air is, the gods. The 13th thing is that in some of the oldest strands of the tradition, there's an even earlier figure. Namu, the primeval sea. She's written with the sign for sea, and she's described as the mother who gave birth to heaven and earth themselves. Namu is one of those figures who's clearly ancient, clearly important, and clearly fading by the time anyone got around to writing much down. She survives in fragments, in a myth about the creation of humankind, in a few hymns. There's a whole older theology behind her that we've simply lost. That happens more often than you'd like. The 14th thing is Enlil, and Enlil is the one who actually runs things. His name means roughly Lord Wind or Lord Air. En is Lord, Lil is wind, breath, the moving air. He held the office called the Enlilship, which was essentially the executive power of the universe, and the great tablet lists of the gods place him just below An and above everyone else. His city was Nippur, which sat in the middle of the Sumerian plain, and was, interestingly, never a political capital. Nippur was not the seat of empire. It was the seat of legitimacy. If you conquered southern Mesopotamia and wanted to be recognized as the rightful king rather than merely a successful thug, you went to Nippur, to Enlil's temple, the Ikur, the mountain house, and you were confirmed there. Kings who never controlled Nippur tended not to be remembered as kings at all. And Enlil is a difficult god. That's the 15th thing. He is not benevolent in the way we might want a chief god to be. He's the one who sends the storm. He's the one who, in the flood story, decides that humanity is too loud and needs to be wiped out. There's a Sumerian myth in which Enlil, as a young god, assaults the goddess Ninlil and is exiled to the underworld for it. And even that story ends not with punishment, but with a strange, tender sequence in which he follows her down into the dark. These gods are not moral examples. They were never meant to be. They're forces, weather, fertility, sovereignty, death, with personalities bolted on, and the personalities are as unpredictable as the forces. The 16th thing, and my personal favorite of the family, is Enki. Enki, later called Ea in Akkadian, is the god of fresh water, of wisdom, of craft, of magic, and of what I can only describe as clever solutions to impossible problems. His domain is the Abzu, the great body of sweet water that the Mesopotamians believed lay underneath the earth, feeding the springs and the marshes and the rivers. His city was Eridu, down in the far south near the marshes, which the Sumerians themselves regarded as the very first city, the oldest place, where kingship first came down from heaven. And Enki is a trickster, not a villain, a trickster. When the other gods make a catastrophic decision, Enki is the one who finds the loophole. When humanity is condemned to die in the flood, Enki is the one who technically obeys the order not to warn any human being, and then goes and talks very loudly to a wall, knowing perfectly well that a man is sleeping on the other side of it. Think about that for a second. A god who saves the world on a technicality. 4,000 years ago, someone sat in a mud brick room and thought that was funny and wrote it down, and here we are. The 17th thing is Ninhursag, the great mother goddess, who goes by an unusual number of names: Ninhursag, Ninmah, Nintu, Aruru, Damgalnuna, Beletili. Her name, Ninhursag, means Lady of the Mountain, and Nintu means something like the lady who gives birth. She's the one who shapes human beings out of clay, and in one myth she and Enki get into a drinking contest in which they take turns making deliberately deformed people and challenging each other to find a place for them in the world, which is, when you look at it closely, an ancient story wrestling with the question of why some people are born with disabilities, and answering that even those lives have an assigned place. It's a strange, uncomfortable, oddly compassionate text. The 18th thing is that these four, An, Enlil, Enki, and Ninhursag, form the core of what the god lists call the great gods, and then below them come the astral deities: Nana the moon, whose city was Ur; Utu the sun, whose cities were Sippar and Larsa; and Inana, who is Venus, and who is by far the most interesting of them all. The 19th thing is that in Mesopotamia, the moon is the father of the sun. That's worth pausing on, because it inverts what we'd expect. Nana, the moon god, is the elder. Utu, the sun, is his son. Which makes sense if you think about who's watching. In a desert country, the sun is a hammer. It's the thing that kills your crops and dries your canals. The moon is what you travel by, what you measure months by, what makes the night bearable. Their calendar was lunar. Their most beloved sky god was the one that came out at night. And Utu, the sun, isn't primarily a god of warmth or life. He's the god of justice, because he sees everything. He crosses the whole sky each day, and there's nothing hidden from him. So he becomes the divine judge, the one you appeal to when you've been wronged in secret. On cylinder seals he's shown rising between two mountains, holding a saw, the tool he uses to cut his way out through the eastern horizon at dawn. The 20th thing is Inana, and Inanna deserves her own paragraph, or frankly, her own night. Later known as Ishtar, she is the goddess of sexual love and of war, which sounds like a contradiction until you spend some time with the texts and realize it isn't. Both are about desire, appetite, overwhelming force. She is the planet Venus, morning star and evening star. She's young, she's ambitious, she's dangerous, and unlike almost every other major deity, She does not have a clearly assigned domain of responsibility handed to her by the elders. She takes what she wants. There's a myth in which she gets Enki drunk and persuades him to hand over the fundamental powers of civilization, and then loads them onto a boat and sails home to Uruk before he sobers up and realizes what he's done. He sends monsters after the boat. She keeps the powers. That's Inana. The 21st thing is those powers themselves, which have a name, the Me. It's spelled M-E, and it's usually left untranslated because there isn't a good English word for it. The Me are the underlying decrees, the fixed principles that make civilization possible. And here's what makes them fascinating. There are lists of them, and the lists are wonderfully unsystematic. Among the Maiho, you'll find kingship, and priesthood, and truth, and the art of the scribe, and the craft of the carpenter, and the making of decisions, and the descent into the underworld, and music, and lamentation, and sexual intercourse, and also, memorably, deceit and strife, and the plundering of cities. The Sumerians did not divide the world into good things and bad things, and assign the bad ones to a devil. They had no devil. War, betrayal, grief, those were structural features of reality, handed down like everything else. Somebody had to be in charge of them. That's a very old and very unsentimental way of looking at existence, and I'd gently suggest it's one of the reasons this literature still lands so hard, 4,000 years later. The 22nd thing is that we know the names of these gods with real precision, because the scribes were obsessive list makers. There's a document scholars call an equals Anum, a great god list running to several tablets, which pairs Sumerian divine names with their Akkadian equivalents, and their family relationships and their functions. Essentially, a divine directory, with something like 2,000 entries. Somebody, or several generations of somebodies, sat down and organized heaven into a filing system. And the 23rd thing is the ranking, which is charmingly bureaucratic. The great gods were assigned numbers. Anu had 60, 60 being the highest number in their system, since Mesopotamian mathematics was sexagesimal, base 60. Enlil had 50. Enki had 40. The moon god 30, the sun god 20, Inana 15. In some texts, a god's number could simply stand in for his name. You could write 60, and everyone knew you meant the sky. By the way, that base 60 system is still in your house right now. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. That's Mesopotamian. You are using Sumerian mathematics every time you glance at a clock, and you have been your whole life without ever once thinking about it. Let that drift past you for a moment. There's no rush. Now, the 24th thing takes us to the heart of what the Anunnaki actually did, and it's not what you might expect. Their central activity, the thing they're described doing over and over, is meeting. They assemble. They convene. The place where they gather has a name, the Upshu Ukina, the courtyard of assembly, and there they sit and they decide destinies. That's the technical phrase, and it turns up constantly, the decreeing of fates. Once a year, at the New Year festival, and at other critical moments, the gods gather, they discuss, they argue, and they fix what will happen to a king, to a city, to a harvest, to a man. Think about what a strange and revealing image that is. The most powerful beings in the universe, and what they do is hold a committee meeting. Not a throne, not a lone commander issuing orders, a room full of divine nobles hashing it out. And the 25th thing follows directly from that. This is almost certainly the sky reflecting the ground. Early Sumerian cities appear to have had genuine assemblies, councils of elders and citizens who deliberated on important matters alongside whatever ruler they had. Some scholars, most famously the Danish-American Assyriologist Thorkild Jacobsen, argued that early Mesopotamia had something he called primitive democracy, and that the divine assembly in the myths is a memory of it, projected upward onto heaven. Whether or not he was entirely right, and there's been plenty of argument about it, the underlying insight is sound. People imagine their gods governing the way they themselves are governed. The Anunnaki hold council because the citizens of Uruk held council. Heaven has the political structure of a Bronze Age city, because that's the only political structure the people writing had ever seen. Now, here's where the story gets genuinely interesting, because we need to talk about the other group of gods, the ones almost nobody has heard of, even though they're the reason the most famous Anunnaki story exists at all. The 26th thing to know is that alongside the Anunnaki, there's a second collective called the Igigi. The word is Akkadian rather than Sumerian. Its origins are murky, and its meaning shifted over time. But broadly, by the 2nd millennium BCE, a distinction had settled into place. The Anunnaki were the senior gods, the great ones, and eventually, more and more, the gods of the earth and the underworld. The Igigi were the younger gods, the gods of heaven, the working generation, the staff, if you like, as opposed to the board. And the 27th thing is that the terms slid around. In the earliest Sumerian material, the Annuna are simply the gods, all of them, heaven and earth together. But over the centuries, as Akkadian replaced Sumerian as the spoken language, and Babylon replaced Sumer as the center of the world, the two words drifted apart and swapped territory. By the later periods, the Igigi are firmly the sky gods, and the Anunnaki are firmly the earth and underworld gods, which is close to the opposite of where they started. I mention this because it matters for a claim you may have encountered. The idea that the Anunnaki were always, from the beginning, described as those who came down from heaven to earth. You can find that phrase all over the internet. It isn't a translation of the name. The name means offspring of An. But the reason the misunderstanding is so sticky is that there's a genuine historical shift underneath it, a group of gods who begin as celestial and end up chthonic, associated with the ground and the dead. Something did, in a sense, come down. It just happened in the language over centuries, in the slow drift of theological bookkeeping. Now, let me tell you about the strike. The 28th thing is a poem called Atrahasis, and if you only remember one text from tonight, make it this one. Atrahasis is an old Babylonian epic written in Akkadian, and our best copy was produced around 1650 BCE. We even know who wrote that copy out, because he signed it. The colophon at the end names a junior scribe called Ku'aya, working in the reign of King Ammi-Saduqa, who was a great-great-grandson of Hammurabi. A junior scribe, a student essentially, or a recent graduate. He copied out one of the greatest poems in human history as an exercise, and put his name at the bottom the way you'd initial a form. And because of that small act of bureaucratic pride, we have the text. The 29th thing is how it opens, and the opening line is one of the great openings in world literature. It goes, in the standard translation, something like, when the gods were man. Or, when the gods were like men, they bore the work and suffered the toil. Stop there for a second. Before humans existed, the gods had to do their own labor. There was nobody else. And the labor described is not abstract. It's canal digging, irrigation work. The gods dug the Tigris and the Euphrates. They hauled the baskets of earth. They carried the loads. For, the poem says, 40 periods of years, a very long time, in any case, long enough that the phrase used is, night and day they groaned and blamed each other. Isn't that extraordinary? The origin of the world in Mesopotamian thought isn't a battle, or a word or a breath. It's a public works project. The 30th thing is who was doing the digging. It was the Igigi, the junior gods. The senior Anunnaki, and here the poem is quite blunt about it, were supervising. The great gods sat, and the lesser gods dug. 7 great Anunnaki, the poem says, were making the lesser gods bear the work. And the 31st thing is that after 40 years of this, the Igigi had had enough. What happens next is, as far as anyone can tell, the first labor strike in recorded literature. It's the middle of the night. The junior gods gather, and one of them, the poem is a little damaged here, but the sense survives, stands up and makes a speech. Let's confront the counselor, he says. Let's set fire to our tools. And they do exactly that. They burn their spades. They burn the baskets they've been carrying the earth in. And then they march, in the dark, on the house of Enlil, and they surround it. Can you picture that? A god waking up in the middle of the night to find a mob of divine laborers outside his door, with the smoke of their burnt equipment still hanging in the air. The 32nd thing is what Enlil does, and it is completely, recognizably human. He panics. His servant Nusku wakes him. Enlil's face goes pale. The text actually says his face turned the color of tamarisk wood. He tells Nusku to bar the door and bring his weapon. Then he does something even more telling. He sends for his father. He summons An down from heaven and Enki up from the sweet waters below, and he essentially says, "Look what they're doing to me." The chief god of the universe, sitting in a room with his dad and his brother, asking whose fault this is. The 33rd thing is the negotiation, because there is one. They send Nusku out to ask who started it, and the strikers give an answer that would fit comfortably into any modern labor dispute. They say, every one of us declared war. All of us. There's no ringleader to hand over. And then they explain their case. The work is excessive, the toil is killing us, it is too much. And here's the part that always astonishes me. Enlil listens, and then Enki, the clever one, says in effect, they're right. The complaint is legitimate. The work genuinely is too heavy. So the gods do not crush the rebellion. They restructure the labor force. The 34th thing is the solution, and it is the reason human beings exist. Enki proposes that they create a new kind of being to carry the workload. He turns to the mother goddess. She's called Nintu, or Mami, or Belet Ili, depending on the passage, and asks her to make a creature that will bear the yoke. And she agrees, but she names a condition. She cannot do it alone. She needs material, and the material is a god. The 35th thing is that they kill one of their own. They select a god. His name is given as Wi Ila, or Au Ilu, or, in some readings, Geshtuhe, and crucially, the poem describes him as the god who had intelligence, or the god who had a plan. They slaughter him in the assembly, and the mother goddess mixes his flesh and his blood into the clay. Sit with that for a moment, because it's one of the most extraordinary ideas in all of ancient religion. Human beings are made of two things: earth and a murdered God's mind. That's what we are. Mud with something divine and something violent folded into it. And the poem draws the consequence explicitly. It says that from the god's flesh there will be a spirit, a ghost, and that this ghost is the proof forever after that a god died to make us. The word used for that spirit, etemu, is the same word the Babylonians used for the ghost of a dead human being. So the reason people have souls in this system is that we're partly made of a corpse. And the reason people have intelligence is that the particular god they killed was the smart one. The 36th thing is the ritual detail that follows, which I find quietly beautiful. The other gods spit on the clay, all of them together. The text says, the Anunnaki, the great gods, spat upon the clay. It's a gesture of collective participation. Everyone's saliva, everyone's consent, everyone implicated. Nobody gets to stand apart from what's about to be made. Then Nintu pinches off 14 pieces of clay. 7 she places on the left, 7 on the right, and between them she puts a brick. And 14 womb goddesses assist. And after 10 months, a womb opens, and the first humans are born. 7 male, 7 female. The brick is not decoration, by the way. In Mesopotamia, women gave birth kneeling or squatting, supported by bricks. The mother goddess creating humanity is doing it in exactly the physical posture that every woman in Babylon knew. The cosmic scene is staged as a delivery room. The 37th thing is what happens next, which is the part that makes Atrahasis a tragedy rather than a creation story. It works. Humans dig the canals. They carry the baskets. They feed the gods with offerings. The system functions. And then people multiply. 1,200 years pass, the poem says. And the land became wide, and the people became numerous, and the land was bellowing like a bull. And Enlil, in his house, could not sleep because of the noise. The 38th thing is that this noise is the stated reason for the destruction of humanity in the oldest flood narrative we possess. Not sin, not wickedness, not moral corruption. Just rigmu, clamor, uproar, the racket of too many people. Scholars have argued for decades about what that really means. Some take it literally. Overpopulation, the unbearable noise of a crowded world. Others read it as a metaphor for social disorder, rebellion, the sound of a species getting out of hand. There's a fine argument that it's about the failure of the original bargain. Humans were made to serve, and instead they've become a civilization in their own right, loud and self-important, and no longer content to be quiet labor. Whatever it means, Enlil's response is escalation. First, he sends a plague. Then, when that fails, a drought. Then a famine so severe that the poem describes, in lines that are genuinely hard to read, mothers shutting their doors against their own hungry children, and eventually the eating of the dead. And each time, a man named Atrahasis, whose name means exceedingly wise, goes to Enki and asks what to do. And each time, Enki finds a way around it. The 39th thing is that this back-and-forth structure is the real architecture of the poem. It's not a single catastrophe. It's a sequence, an escalating argument between two gods about what to do with the species they built, conducted through a human intermediary who keeps quietly winning on procedural grounds. Enlil wants humanity reduced. Enki keeps saving it. And after each failure, Enlil grows angrier, until finally he stands up in the assembly and demands that all the gods swear an oath that this time nobody will warn them. and they all swear, including Enki. The 40th thing is the loophole, and it's the moment I mentioned earlier. Bound by an oath not to speak to any human being, Enki goes to the reed wall of Atrahasis' house, and he talks to the wall. "Reed wall," he says, "listen to me. Wall, pay attention. Tear down your house and build a boat. Abandon possessions and save life." He is technically not addressing a person. He's addressing architecture. And on the other side of that thin reed wall, a man is lying awake, listening to every word. Think about how carefully constructed that is. A god finds a legal technicality in a divine oath in order to save the species, 4,000 years ago. Somebody thought that up. The 41st thing is the flood itself, and the description is terrifying in a very physical way. The storm god Adad roars in the clouds. The Anunnaki, the poem says, took up torches, setting the land ablaze with their brightness as they went. And then the deluge came. And the flood is described with a phrase that has haunted me since I first read it. No one could see anyone else. They could not be recognized in the destruction. And then something turns. The gods, watching from above, begin to break down. The mother goddess who made humanity is described weeping and screaming, saying, "How could I have agreed to this in the assembly? How could I have spoken for their destruction?" And the Anunnaki, the great gods, are described sitting in thirst and hunger, because the humans who fed them with offerings are gone, and now the gods themselves are starving. Their lips are crusted with fever. They destroyed their own food supply. That's the sting in the tale. The gods discover too late that they need us as much as we need them. The 42nd thing is the ending, which is not a triumph but a compromise. Atrahasis survives, makes an offering, and the gods, the poem says, gathered around it like flies. And when Enlil arrives and sees a human being still alive, he's furious, and there's an argument, and Enki defends what he did. And the resolution they reach is not to spare humanity unconditionally and not to destroy it. Instead, they introduce limits. From now on, there will be women who cannot bear children. There will be a demon who takes infants from their mothers' laps. There will be classes of priestesses forbidden to have children at all. In other words, mortality management, population control, written into the structure of the world by treaty. It's bleak, and it's also, in a strange way, the most honest ending imaginable. The problem was never solved. It was regulated. If you're drifting at this point, that's just fine. Let the flood wash back out. We're moving forward in time now, about 500 years, to a different city and a much grander poem. The 43rd thing to know is the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian epic of creation, 7 tablets long, roughly 1,000 lines, and named, as Mesopotamian texts always are, after its opening words. Enuma Elish means when on high. When on high the heavens had not been named. It probably reached its final form somewhere in the late 2nd millennium BCE, and it exists for a political reason. Babylon had risen from a minor town on the Euphrates to the dominant power in Mesopotamia, and Babylon's city god Marduk was an unremarkable local deity with no ancient pedigree at all. This was a problem. In a culture where authority came from antiquity, you could not simply announce that your parvenu god now outranked Enlil of Nippur, who had been running the universe since before anyone could remember. So they wrote him a story. The Enuma Elish is, among other things, the most sophisticated piece of theological public relations ever produced. It explains, at great length and with real literary power, exactly why the newcomer deserves the throne. The 44th thing is how it begins, and the beginning is genuinely strange and beautiful. Before anything existed, there were two waters mingling together, Apsu, the fresh water, and Tiamat, the salt sea. No sky, no earth, no names, no destinies fixed, just water flowing into water in the dark. And out of that mingling, gods are born. And the gods are noisy. You'll notice we've been here before. The younger generation is loud, and it disturbs the older generation's rest. Apsu can't sleep. He goes to Tiamat and proposes that they destroy their own children so he can get some peace. Tiamat is appalled. How could we destroy what we made? But Apsu's counselor, a figure called Mumu, encourages him. The 45th thing is that Enki, here called Ea, finds out. And what he does is quietly extraordinary. He doesn't fight Apsu. He casts a spell that puts him to sleep, a sleep spell poured over the god of fresh water, and then kills him while he sleeps and builds his own house on top of him. Ea's dwelling, the Abzu, is literally constructed on the body of the primordial father, and it's there, in that house built on a corpse, that Marduk is born. The 46th thing is Tiamat's response, which takes a while to arrive. At first, she does nothing. Then, gradually, the surviving gods work on her, telling her she's been dishonored, that she slept while her husband was murdered. And eventually, she rises. And she builds an army. She creates 11 monsters, serpents, a lion man, a scorpion man, a bull man, the storm demons, dragons filled with venom instead of blood, and she appoints a consort called Chingu as commander, and she fastens the tablet of destinies to his chest. That tablet is worth pausing on. The tablet of destinies is a physical object, in Mesopotamian thought, which confers the authority to decree what will happen. Whoever holds it holds the future. It's not a metaphor to them. It's a clay tablet with a seal on it, and possessing it means possessing legitimate power. Bureaucracy, again, all the way to the roots of the cosmos. The 47th thing is the panic among the gods, and this is where our Anunnaki come back in. The great gods hear that Tiamat is coming, and they are terrified. Ea goes and can't face her. Anu, the sky himself, goes out to confront her and turns back. The text describes the assembly sitting in silence, their lips sealed, unable to act. The 48th thing is Marduk's price. The young god says he will fight, but only on one condition. If he wins, the assembly must give him the supreme authority. His word must fix destinies. Whatever he decrees must stand unaltered. And here comes a detail I love. The gods are not sure, so they hold a banquet. They eat bread and they drink wine. The text says beer, sweet drink, and they get thoroughly, comprehensively drunk, and their bodies swell, and their moods turn expansive. And in that state, they vote him the kingship of the universe. The most consequential constitutional decision in Babylonian cosmology is made by a room full of drunk gods. That is in the text. That is what it says. The 49th thing is the test they set him. They put a garment in the middle of the assembly and tell him, destroy it by speaking, then restore it by speaking. He does. The cloth vanishes at his word and returns at his word. And the gods cry out, Marduk is king. The 50th thing is the battle, which is one of the great set pieces of ancient literature. Marduk arms himself, bow, mace, lightning, a net held at the four corners by the four winds, and then he creates 7 more winds. The whirlwind, the cyclone, the matchless wind. He mounts a storm chariot pulled by 4 creatures with poison in their teeth, and he rides out to meet the sea, and he taunts her, and she goes into a rage. And when she opens her mouth to swallow him, he drives the evil wind into her mouth so that she cannot close it, and her belly distends, and he shoots an arrow through her open jaws into her heart. Then he splits her in half, the text says, like a dried fish. And with one half he makes the sky, holding back her waters with a bolt and posting guards to make sure it never leaks. And with the other half he makes the earth. Her breasts become mountains. The Tigris and Euphrates come out of her eyes. Sit with that image for a moment before you drift. The rivers of Iraq in this poem are the tears of a dead sea goddess, and the sky above you tonight is her rib cage, holding back an ocean. The 51st thing is that Chingu is executed too, and his blood is used to make humanity, which is the same idea we saw in Atrahasis, humans made from a slaughtered god, but with a darker twist. In Atrahasis, the god who dies is the intelligent one. Here, he's the rebel, the enemy commander. In Enuma Elish, humanity is made from the blood of a traitor, and the stated purpose is identical. So the gods may be at rest. So somebody else does the work. The 52nd thing is the number, and this is where the Anunnaki get their most famous head count. After the victory, Marduk organizes the divine world. He takes the Anunnaki and divides them, 300 to the heavens, to keep watch there, and 300 to the earth. 600 in total. 600 is not a random figure. It's 10 60s. In a base 60 system, it is as round and satisfying a number as 1,000 is to us. The universe is being organized, and the organization has the texture of a ledger. The 53rd thing is what the Anunnaki do next, and it's the detail that ties this whole enormous cosmic poem back to the mud of the plain. They're grateful. They want to honor Marduk. So they ask permission to build him something, and Marduk agrees, and the Anunnaki, the great gods, the divine nobility, pick up brick molds. They make bricks. For 1 full year, the text says, they made bricks. And with those bricks they raised Babylon, and the temple Esagila and its tower. The gods, at the end of the story of creation, become construction workers. And the thing they build is a specific building in a specific city that you could have walked to. It's still there, in ruins, about 50 miles south of Baghdad. The 54th thing is the ending of the poem, which is not a battle scene, but a recitation of names. The final tablet and a half consists of the gods proclaiming Marduk's 50 names, each one a title, each one explained, each one transferring some quality or office to him. 50, you'll remember, was Enlil's number. The poem is quite deliberately handing over Enlil's rank, name by name, in public, in front of the assembly, and the very last lines instruct that these names be learned, that a father should teach them to his son, that the wise should discuss them. It ends as a lesson plan. The 55th thing is that this poem was performed. On the 4th day of the New Year festival, the Akitu, in the spring month of Nisanu, the whole Enuma Elish was recited aloud in the temple at Babylon. The entire creation of the universe, spoken from beginning to end, once a year, in a room. And the 56th thing is what else happened at that festival, which is one of the most astonishing rituals I know of. On the 5th day, the king of Babylon entered the shrine, and the high priest took away his scepter, his ring, his weapon, and his crown, and set them aside. And then the priest struck the king across the face. Hard enough, ideally, to bring tears, because tears were a good omen, a sign the god was pleased. Then the king, stripped of everything, knelt and made what scholars call a negative confession. He declared what he had not done. He had not neglected the temple. He had not destroyed Babylon. He had not struck the cheek of a citizen under his protection. And only then were the crown and the scepter handed back to him. Once a year, the most powerful man in the ancient Near East was slapped in the face by a priest and made to account for himself. Think about what that says about how these people understood power. The king held authority on loan from an assembly of gods, renewable annually, subject to review. The 57th thing is that the Anunnaki were present at that festival, not as an idea, but as objects. Statues of the gods from other cities were brought into Babylon for the new year, traveling by boat and cart along the rivers and roads, met at the city gates by crowds. They processed along the processional way, through the Ishtar Gate with its blue-glazed bricks and its dragons and bulls in relief, and into the temple, where they sat together in the Chamber of Destinies, and, in the fiction of the ritual, decided the fate of the coming year. You could stand in the street and watch the gods arrive. That was the point. Religion was not primarily belief. It was attendance. The 58th thing, and this one is quietly devastating, is what it meant when a statue was taken away. When an enemy sacked a Mesopotamian city, they often carried off the god, not destroyed it, captured it, and the city would then say that its god had abandoned it, had grown angry, had left. There's an entire genre of Sumerian literature devoted to this. The city laments. The lamentation over the destruction of Ur is a long, extraordinary poem in which the goddess Ningal pleads with the assembly of the gods, with An and Enlil and the Anunnaki, not to destroy her city, and is refused, and then wanders through the ruins describing what she sees. Bodies in the streets like fat left in the sun, doors standing open where the wind goes in and out. It was written, most likely, about the actual fall of Ur to the Elamites around 2004 BCE. Real smoke, real bodies. And the theology that framed it said, this happened because the assembly decided it, and even the city's own goddess could not vote it down. Let's stay with this a moment, and then go somewhere darker and stranger. Down, in fact. Because the single most vivid appearance of the Anunnaki in all of Mesopotamian literature happens underground. The 59th thing to know is a Sumerian poem usually called The Descent of Inana, which survives on tablets from around 1750 BCE and runs to more than 400 lines. It opens with one of the great first lines. From the great above, she set her mind toward the great below. Inanna, the goddess of love and war, the morning star, the one who takes what she wants, decides to go to the underworld. The poem doesn't clearly explain why. She may be going to attend a funeral. She may be attempting a takeover. The ambiguity is probably deliberate. The 60th thing is the underworld itself, and it is worth understanding because it's so unlike what most of us grew up imagining. The Mesopotamian land of the dead is called Kur, or Irkala, and it's not a place of punishment. It isn't hell. There's no judgment by moral standard, no reward for the righteous. Everyone goes there. Kings, priests, infants, murderers, all of them. It's a house, in the words of one text, where the dwellers are deprived of light, where dust is their food and clay their bread, and where they are clothed like birds with wings for garments. That image has never left me. The dead sitting in the dark in feathers, and it's ruled by a queen, Ereshkigal, Inanna's older sister, one of the very few major deities in the ancient world who is unambiguously female and unambiguously sovereign in her own right. The 61st thing is Inanna's preparation, which is meticulous. Before she goes, she puts on the 7 Me, the divine powers, in physical form. A crown on her head, lapis beads at her throat, a double strand of stones on her chest, a breastplate, a gold ring on her wrist, a lapis measuring rod and line in her hand, and a garment called the pala, the robe of ladyship. She dresses for the underworld the way you dress for a state visit, fully armed in jewelry, and she gives instructions to her servant Ninshubur. If I do not return in 3 days, go and weep for me. Go to Enlo. If he refuses, go to Nana. If he refuses, go to Enki, to Nana. If he refuses, go to Enki, because Enki knows the water of life, and Enki knows the food of life. She's planning for failure before she starts. That detail alone tells you she knows exactly how dangerous this is. The 62nd thing is the 7 gates. At the outer gate she meets the gatekeeper, Neti, and demands entry. He goes to Ereshkigal, who, the text says, slaps her thigh and bites her lip, and gives an order. Let her in, but bolt the 7 gates of the underworld behind her, and at each gate remove 1 thing. And that's what happens. At the first gate, they take the crown. She asks, "What is this?" And the answer, repeated 7 times, is one of the most chilling refrains in ancient literature. Quiet, Inanna. The ways of the underworld are perfect. They may not be questioned. Gate by gate. The crown, the beads, the stones, the breastplate, the ring, the rod, and, finally, the robe. And she enters the throne room naked and bowed low. The 63rd thing is what waits for her there. Ereshkigal rises, and Inanna takes her seat, an act of open usurpation. And then the 7 Anunnaki, the judges, fix their eyes on her, the eyes of death. And they speak the word of wrath, and they cry out the cry of guilt. 7 judges. A trial that lasts 1 line. A verdict with no defense. And Inanna is struck down and turned into a corpse, and the corpse is hung on a hook on the wall. The 64th thing is that she hangs there for 3 days and 3 nights. 3 days. Anyone who knows the later religious history of the Near East will feel a small jolt at that. I want to be careful here, because this is exactly the sort of parallel that gets wildly overinterpreted online. But, as a plain matter of literary history, a dying and returning deity, gone for 3 days, is an old Mesopotamian pattern, written down more than 1,000 years before the Common Era. The 65th thing is the rescue, and it is pure Enki. Ninshubur does as she was told. Enlil refuses to help. Nana refuses. Enki agrees immediately, and his method is characteristically odd. He scrapes the dirt from under his fingernails, and from that dirt fashions 2 creatures, neither male nor female, called the Kurgara and the Galatur. Small, sexless, unimportant beings who can slip through the cracks of the underworld like flies through a doorway. And he gives them precise instructions. When you get there, you will find Ereshkigal in agony, moaning like a woman in labor, with nothing covering her. Her hair swirling about her head like leeks, and she will cry out, "Oh, my inside! Oh, my outside!" And you must say back to her, "Oh, your inside! Oh, your outside!" That's it. That's the entire rescue plan. Echo her pain. The 66th thing is that it works. Ereshkigal, who has been in agony that nobody has ever acknowledged, is so moved by these 2 little creatures simply repeating her suffering back to her that she offers them a gift. And they refuse everything she offers, the water gift, the grain gift, and ask only for the corpse hanging on the hook. Think about what that story is saying. The most powerful goddess in the world goes down armored in every symbol of authority she has, and fails. And the thing that finally works, the only thing, is two nobodies made of fingernail dirt who sit with the suffering woman and say, "I hear you. That's it. That's the mechanism." I don't think you need me to explain why that story lasted 4,000 years. The 67th thing is the price, because there always is one. Inana is revived with the food and water of life, but the Anunnaki sees her as she tries to leave, and they lay down a law. No one ascends from the underworld unmarked. If she goes up, someone must come down in her place, and so she is escorted back to the surface by a horde of demons called the Gala, who are described in a passage I find genuinely unsettling. They know no food, they know no drink, they eat no offerings, they drink no libations, they accept no gifts. They tear the wife from a man's embrace, they tear the child from the father's knee. You cannot bribe them, that's the whole point of them. Everything else in Mesopotamian religion can be negotiated with. Gods take offerings, demons take amulets, kings take silver. The Gala take nothing. They are the part of reality that does not do deals. The 68th thing is the choice she has to make. Everywhere Inanna goes, the demons offer to take the person in front of her. And each time she refuses, because each of them is in mourning, dressed in rags, sitting in the dust, grieving for her. Ninshuber, her loyal servant, no. The god Shara, no. The god Lulal, no. And then she comes to her own city, Uruk, and finds her husband Dumuzi sitting on a throne in clean, magnificent clothes, not mourning at all. And she looks at him with the eye of death, and says, "Take him." The 69th thing is that the story doesn't end in triumph there either. Dumuzi runs. He weeps and prays to Utu, the sun god, who transforms him into a gazelle so he can escape. He's caught anyway. And then his sister, Geshtinana, does something no one asked her to do. She offers to take his place. And the resolution reached is that each of them will spend half the year below. 6 months her, 6 months him. And that is the Mesopotamian explanation for the seasons. The god of the shepherd and the sap and the grain goes down into the earth for half the year, and while he's gone, things wither. Later, there was an annual festival of weeping for Dumuzi, Tammuz, in the later spelling, in the heat of midsummer, when the pastures burned brown. The month of Tammuz is still on the Iraqi and Levantine calendar. It's July. The 70th thing, and it's a small one that says a lot, is that a version of this weeping ritual is mentioned in the Hebrew Bible. In the book of Ezekiel, the prophet describes being shown an abomination at the north gate of the temple in Jerusalem, women sitting, weeping for Tammuz. It's a single verse, but it means that in the 6th century BCE in Jerusalem, this Sumerian shepherd god who died so his wife could come back up out of the dark was still being mourned by real women in real streets. The story we've been following tonight was, for them, current events. The 71st thing takes us to the most famous Mesopotamian text of all, and to the Anunnaki's appearance in it, the Epic of Gilgamesh. And I'll resist telling you the whole thing, because it deserves its own long night. A king of Uruk, 2/3 god, arrogant and unbearable. A wild man, Enkidu, created to match him. A friendship. a killing of a monster in a cedar forest, and then Enkidu's death and the grief that follows it, which is where the poem becomes something more than an adventure. The 72nd thing is the 11th tablet, which is where our thread runs. Gilgamesh, unable to accept that he will die, goes searching for the one man who escaped death, Utnapishtim, the survivor of the flood. And Utnapishtim tells him the story. And it's the Atrahasis flood again, retold, absorbed into the greater epic. And when the flood comes, the poem says the Anunnaki lifted up their torches, lighting the land with their brightness. And then it says something remarkable. The gods themselves were terrified of the deluge they had made. They shrank back. They went up to the highest heaven, and there they cowered, crouching like dogs against a wall. The gods, afraid of their own storm, huddled at the top of the sky like frightened animals. That's not a triumphant image of divinity. That's a description of people who have started something they can't stop. The 73rd thing is the raven and the dove, because it's the detail everybody recognizes. Utnapishtim's boat grounds on a mountain called Nimush, and after 7 days he releases a dove, which finds no resting place and comes back. Then a swallow, which comes back. Then a raven, which does not come back, because the waters have receded and it has found food. That's in a cuneiform tablet copied out for the library of an Assyrian king. Its relationship to the very similar sequence in the book of Genesis has been argued over passionately since the day it was translated, and we're going to get to that argument shortly, because it is one of the great stories of 19th century scholarship. The 74th thing is what the Anunnaki became by the end of Mesopotamian history, judges of the dead. In the later Assyrian and Babylonian material, they're firmly underworld figures, seated in Ereshkigal's court, associated with the ground, the grave, and the fixing of fates for the departed. There's a remarkable Assyrian text, sometimes called the Underworld Vision of an Assyrian Prince, in which a man named Kumaya asks to see the underworld and gets his wish, and describes, in horrifying detail, a hall full of hybrid monsters and a throne, and wakes in terror. Be careful what you ask the Anunnaki for. That's more or less the moral. The 75th thing is that they show up in the law, too. Hammurabi's famous law code, carved on a black diorite stele over 7 feet tall, found not in Babylon, but at Susa, in Iran, where invading Elamites had carried it off as loot, excavated by a French team in the winter of 1901 and 1902, opens and closes with theology. And in the epilogue, when Hammurabi curses anyone who would alter his laws, he calls on the gods to bring that man down. The great Anunnaki are invoked, their assembly, their judgment, their word. So, the last thing a person read on the most famous legal monument of the ancient world was a threat backed by the divine council. Not a police force, a committee of gods. Now let's back up and let me tell you how any of this came to be known at all, because for a very long stretch of history, none of it was. The 76th thing to understand is that Sumer was completely forgotten. Not misunderstood, forgotten. The last cuneiform tablet we can date was written in the 1st century of the Common Era, an astronomical text, probably from Babylon. And after that, the script died, and the languages died with it, and everything that had been written in them became silent marks on broken clay. Babylon and Nineveh survived as names in the Bible and in Greek historians. Sumer survived as nothing. For roughly 1,800 years, nobody on Earth knew that the first civilization had existed. Think about that for a second. An entire founding culture of the human species, the inventors of writing, of the wheeled vehicle in its early forms, of the sexagesimal system on your clock, simply gone from memory. Not one person alive knew their name. The 77th thing is how the door was opened, and it happened on a cliff in western Iran. There's a limestone rock face at a place called Behistun, on the old road between Baghdad and Tehran, and about 220 feet up it, there's an enormous carved relief with a very long inscription, made around 520 BCE by Darius the Great. It shows the king with his foot on a defeated rival, and the text records his version of how he took the throne. And, crucially, it's written 3 times, in 3 languages: Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian. A trilingual inscription. A key. The 78th thing is the man who copied it, and his method was insane. Henry Creswick Rawlinson was a British Army officer serving in Persia, and, beginning in the 1830s, he climbed that cliff repeatedly, standing on a narrow ledge, leaning out over a drop, copying wedge by wedge into a notebook. For the highest and least reachable sections he eventually employed a local Kurdish boy, who scaled a section of rock that Rawlinson had judged unclimbable, hammered in pegs, swung across on a rope, and took paper squeezes of the text. That is how the world got its Rosetta Stone for cuneiform. A soldier, a cliff, a rope, and a boy nobody bothered to record the name of. The 79th thing is that decipherment was contested and slow, and the scholars involved were not always on speaking terms. Rawlinson in England, Edward Hincks, an Irish clergyman working quietly in a rural parish in County Down, and Jules Aupert in France, among others. Hincks, in particular, made breakthroughs that Rawlinson was slow to credit, which is a pattern you'll notice repeats in this field. And the 80th thing is how they proved it, which was a genuinely brilliant idea. By 1857, there was widespread suspicion that these men were fooling themselves, that you could not really read this stuff, and they were making it up. So the Royal Asiatic Society ran an experiment. They took a newly discovered inscription of the Assyrian king Tiglath-Pileser I that none of the scholars had seen, and sent sealed copies to 4 of them: Rawlinson, Hincks, Aupert, and a talented amateur named William Henry Fox Talbot, who, by the way, was also one of the inventors of photography, because the 19th century was like that. Each man translated it independently, under seal, with no contact. The results were opened by a committee and compared, and they matched, not word for word, but substantially, unmistakably. The proper names, the numbers, the sense of it. Cuneiform was readable. It had been demonstrated in public, under controlled conditions. That's the moment Assyriology became a science. The 81st thing is the library, and it's the single greatest source we have. In the 1840s and 1850s, excavators working at the mounds across the river from Mosul in northern Iraq, the site of Nineveh, began pulling up tablets. Austin Henry Layard, a British adventurer and later politician, did the early work. But the man who found the greatest concentration was Hormuzd Rassam, and Rassam is a figure who deserves far more attention than he's had. The 82nd thing is who Rassam was. He was not British. He was an Assyrian Christian, born in Mosul around 1826, a native of the very landscape he was excavating. He worked as Layard's assistant, then studied briefly at Oxford, and then ran his own excavations. and in December 1853, digging at night on a section of the mound that had been assigned to a rival French team, which is its own scandalous story, he broke into the North Palace of Ashurbanipal and found rooms whose floors were covered in tablets to a depth of half a foot. Roughly 30,000 tablets and fragments went to the British Museum. The Epic of Gilgamesh is in there. Atrahasis is in there. Enuma Elish is in there. And Rassam spent much of the rest of his life fighting to be properly credited in a scholarly world that was not inclined to give an Iraqi man the same standing as an English one. Some of the discoveries were quietly reattributed. He sued a British Museum official for libel in 1893 and won. The 83rd thing is whose library it was. Ashurbanipal, king of Assyria from about 669 to 631 BCE, was in most respects a conventionally brutal Iron Age emperor, and in one respect a genuine oddity. He could read. He boasts about it in his inscriptions, that he learned the scribal art, that he could read the obscure Sumerian and the difficult Akkadian, that he understood tablets from before the flood. And he sent agents throughout his empire with instructions to acquire texts. Find the tablets, copy them, bring them back. He was building a universal library 3 centuries before Alexandria. And when Nineveh fell in 612 BCE to a coalition of Babylonians and Medes, and the palace burned, the fire baked his collection hard and buried it. And that is precisely why we can read it today. His empire lasted a few more decades. His library lasted 2,500 years. I don't think anybody has ever built a better argument for writing things down. The 84th thing is the moment of rediscovery, and it belongs to a man named George Smith. And I love this story more than almost any other in the history of scholarship. Smith was not a gentleman scholar. He was born in Chelsea in 1840 into a working-class family, left school at 14, and was apprenticed as a banknote engraver. He was good at it. Engraving requires exactly the kind of close, patient eye for tiny detail that reading damaged cuneiform requires. And he became obsessed with Assyria. He spent his lunch hours at the British Museum, standing in front of the cases, every day, for years. Eventually, the staff noticed him. Someone gave him small jobs joining fragments together, and it turned out this young engraver had an almost supernatural gift for it, for seeing which broken piece of clay belonged against which other broken piece, out of tens of thousands. The 85th thing is what he found in 1872. Sorting through fragments from Nineveh, he came across a piece of a tablet describing a ship coming to rest on a mountain and the sending out of a dove. He was reading the flood story, not the biblical one, an older one. The story that has come down to us, reported by his colleague E. A. Wallace Budge, is that Smith became so overwhelmed that he jumped up, ran around the room, and began to undress. Budge is not the most reliable narrator in the world, and the tale has grown in the telling. But something happened in that room. A former banknote engraver standing over a broken piece of clay understood that he was the first person in 2,500 years to read this, and that it was going to detonate. The 86th thing is the lecture. On the 3rd of December, 1872, Smith presented the text to the Society of Biblical Archaeology in London. The Prime Minister, William Gladstone, was reportedly in the audience. In a Victorian Britain already convulsed by arguments about Genesis and geology and Darwin, here was a Babylonian flood narrative, predating the Hebrew Bible, dug out of a hill in Iraq. The 87th thing is what happened next, which tells you exactly how big the story was. The tablet was incomplete. 17 lines were missing, and a newspaper, the Daily Telegraph, offered 1,000 guineas to fund an expedition to go and find the rest. A newspaper paid for an archaeological dig to complete a poem, and here is the part that strains belief. Smith went to Nineveh, and within about 5 days of serious digging, among the debris of previous excavations, he found a fragment containing most of the missing lines. Out of a hill full of shattered clay, in a matter of days, he found the piece he was looking for. The 88th thing is the sad ending, because there is one. Smith returned to the field again, and in 1876, traveling in intense heat with the region in the grip of an epidemic, he fell ill and died near Aleppo. He was 36 years old. He left a wife and children with very little money. The man who reopened the oldest literature on Earth got about 4 years to enjoy it. The 89th thing is the scholar who did more than anyone to give Sumer specifically, as opposed to Assyria and Babylon, back to the world. Samuel Noah Kramer was born in 1897 in a village in what is now Ukraine, and came to Philadelphia as a small child when his family fled the pogroms. He spent his life reading Sumerian tablets, many of them in the collections of the University of Pennsylvania and Istanbul, and his great insight was that thousands of literary fragments scattered across different museums in different countries were pieces of the same poems. So he traveled, and copied, and matched, and reassembled. Inanna's descent, the Sumerian flood story, the debates and hymns and proverbs. In 1956, he published a book called History Begins at Sumer, structured as a list of 39 firsts: the first schools, the first legal precedent, the first case of tax reduction, the first love song, the first library catalog. He worked well into his 90s. And the 90th thing is one of those firsts, which I want to be sure you hear tonight. The earliest author in human history, whose name we know, the first person on earth to write in the first person and sign it, was a woman. Her name was Enheduanna. She was the daughter of Sargon of Akkad, and around 2300 BCE, her father appointed her high priestess of the moon god at Ur. A shrewd political move, installing his own daughter at the religious heart of the conquered South. And she wrote a cycle of temple hymns and a long, extraordinary personal poem to Inanna called The Exaltation of Inanna, in which she describes being driven out of her temple by a usurper, wandering in exile, and pleading with the goddess to restore her. She names herself in it. She writes about her own suffering and her own voice going hoarse. There is a line where she says that what she recited to the goddess in the deep of night, the singer will repeat at midday. A carved alabaster disc showing her performing a ritual was excavated at Ur by Leonard Woolley's team in the 1920s. Her name is on the back. 4,300 years ago. Before Homer, before the Bible, before anyone, a woman in a temple in Iraq wrote down what it felt like to be her. Let's slow down here, because we're approaching the strange part of the story, and I want to lay one more piece of groundwork first. The 91st thing is Leonard Woolley's excavation of Ur, which ran from 1922 to 1934, and was, in its day, as famous as Tutankhamun. Woolley dug into the royal cemetery and found something almost nobody was prepared for: mass graves. 16 tombs, dating to around 2500 BCE, in which a principal person was buried along with attendants, in one case dozens of them, soldiers with their weapons, women in elaborate headdresses of gold leaf and lapis and carnelian, musicians with their lyres still beside them, oxen and carts driven down into the pit. Woolley believed they went willingly, drank something, and lay down. More recent work, including CT scanning of 2 skulls at the Penn Museum around 2009, found evidence suggesting some may instead have been killed by a blow to the head with a sharp instrument, and then heated and treated with mercury to preserve the bodies for the ceremony. The most famous occupant is a woman whose name is read as Puabi, known from a cylinder seal of lapis lazuli found with her. She was buried under an extraordinary headdress of gold and beads, which you can go and look at in Philadelphia today. Her attendants were arranged around her. That's the world that produced these poems. Beautiful, brilliant, and capable of things we can barely look at directly. The 92nd thing is the first museum, which is one of my favorite facts in all of archaeology. In the same city, Woolley's team excavated a room in a building from around 530 BCE, and in that room they found a collection of objects, a fragment of a statue, a boundary stone, a piece of a very old inscription, all of them already ancient at the time they were collected, gathered from different periods spanning 1,500 years. And beside them was a clay cylinder with an inscription written in 3 languages, describing what the objects were and where they came from. Museum labels, actual museum labels, from the 6th century BCE. The collection appears to be associated with Inana, daughter of Nabonidus, the last king of Babylon. And Nabonidus himself was famously obsessed with the deep past. He dug into the foundations of ancient temples, looking for the inscriptions of earlier kings, and had them read and restored buildings according to what he found. There is a real argument for calling him the first archaeologist. He was excavating ruins that were, to him, as distant as he is to us. Sit with that for a second. A princess in Babylon, 2,500 years ago, curating a museum of antiquities and writing the placards. The past has always had a past. The 93rd thing is the Sumerian king list, and this is the document that launched 1,000 YouTube videos. So let's look at it honestly. It's a text that survives in a number of copies. The best known is a small clay prism in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, and it lists the kings of Mesopotamia in sequence, city by city, with the lengths of their reigns. And it begins before the flood. When kingship came down from heaven, it says, kingship was in Eridu, and Alulim became king, and he ruled 28,800 years. Then the next king, 36,000 years, and so on, through 8 kings in 5 cities, totaling, in the standard version, 241,200 years before the flood. Then the flood sweeps over, and afterward, kingship comes down from heaven a second time, and the reigns immediately become shorter, 1,200 years, 900 years, and then shorter still, until eventually you reach kings we can independently verify from other records, ruling for perfectly ordinary human lifetimes. The 94th thing is what scholars actually make of those numbers, because it's more interesting than either it's literally true or it's just nonsense. Some of the figures resolve neatly in base 60. They're built out of 60s and 60s squared, which suggests they're schematic rather than recorded. There's a genuine, decades-long argument about whether some numbers were mathematically transformed, and there are proposals about the notation being misread. What almost everyone agrees on is that the antediluvian section is not a historical record. It's a framework, a way of expressing that the deep past was of a different order, that kings before the flood were closer to the gods, and therefore lived on a divine timescale. And the general shape of it, enormously long-lived rulers before a great flood, sharply shorter lifespans afterward, will feel familiar to anyone who has read the early chapters of Genesis, with Methuselah at 969 years. These are related traditions from the same part of the world, thinking in the same idiom. Now, the 95th thing. In 1976, a man named Zecharia Sitchin published a book called The 12th Planet, and everything the general public thinks it knows about the Anunnaki comes, directly or indirectly, from that book and its sequels. Sitchin was born in Baku in 1920, raised in Palestine, worked as a journalist and an executive in shipping, and had a real interest in and some study of ancient languages. His thesis, developed across a series called The Earth Chronicles, was this: the Anunnaki were not gods. They were flesh and blood extraterrestrials from a planet he called Nibiru, which he said had an enormous elliptical orbit around our sun, returning every 3,600 years. They came to Earth roughly 450,000 years ago, because their atmosphere was failing and they needed gold to repair it. They landed in the Persian Gulf and mined in southern Africa. And when the junior members of the expedition mutinied over the working conditions, the chief scientist genetically engineered a hybrid worker by combining their own DNA with that of a local hominid. That hybrid was us. You can see, I hope, exactly how that was assembled. The strike in Atrahasis, the creation of humans as a labor force, the god's flesh and blood mixed into the clay, the name meaning offspring of An, where An means sky. Sitchin took the actual structure of a real Babylonian poem and reread every element of it as a technical, literal science fiction account. The 96th thing is why the professional consensus rejects it, and I want to explain this carefully, without contempt, because the reasons are specific and they're worth knowing. Start with Nibiru. The word is real. It appears in Akkadian texts, but it isn't a hidden 12th planet. In Mesopotamian astronomical writing, Nibiru means something like crossing, or ferry, or ford, a crossing point. It's applied to a celestial position, and it's most often associated with the planet Jupiter, and in the Enuma Elish it's connected to Marduk's star, described as holding the crossing place of heaven and earth so that the stars keep their paths. There is no text describing a planet on a 3,600-year orbit populated by anybody. Then there's the count. Sitchin's 12 planets requires the Sumerians to have known of all the outer planets, plus the sun and moon and one extra. But the visible planets, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, are exactly the ones you can see without a telescope, and those are the ones Mesopotamian astronomers tracked meticulously for centuries. Their astronomy is extraordinarily good precisely because it's observational. There's no evidence they knew about Uranus or Neptune, and no text listing 12 planets at all. The 97th thing is the seal, because it's the single image most often used as proof, and it's worth knowing what it actually is. There's a cylinder seal in the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin, catalogued as VA243, which shows two seated figures and, in the upper left, a star symbol surrounded by a ring of dots. Sitchin presented this as a Sumerian diagram of the solar system, with the sun at the center and the planets around it, including his extra one. But the symbol is a standard star, of a type that appears on a great many seals, and in Mesopotamian convention, the sun is drawn differently. The dots don't match the planetary count, and the inscription on the seal isn't astronomical at all. It's an ordinary ownership dedication naming a person and describing another as their servant, which is what the great majority of cylinder seal inscriptions are. It's a business card. The Assyriologist Michael Heiser, who spent years working through Sitchin's claims, line by line against the actual cuneiform, made the point that you can check this. The texts are published. The sign lists are published. The dictionaries, the enormous Chicago Assyrian Dictionary, finished in 2011 after 90 years of work, are freely available online. Anyone with patience can look up whether a word means what someone says it means. The 98th thing, and I want to say this gently, is that the popularity of the Sitchin version is not really about evidence. It's about a very human hunger. We want the deep past to be more than mud and barley receipts. We want a secret. And there's an unlovely undercurrent in a lot of ancient astronaut writing, which is that it tends to arrive at the conclusion that ancient non-European peoples couldn't possibly have built their own monuments or invented their own ideas, that somebody must have come down and shown them. The Sumerians invented writing. In mud. By themselves. Nobody handed it to them. And I'd argue that's a far more staggering claim than any spaceship. The 99th thing is that we're still finding tablets. Estimates vary, but something on the order of 500,000 cuneiform tablets are sitting in museum collections around the world, and a large fraction of them have never been fully published or translated. Not hidden, just unread, because there have never been enough specialists, and each tablet takes real time. Machine learning tools have started to help with sign recognition and with matching fragments to their broken partners. And in the last few years, there have been genuine finds made that way. Joins nobody had spotted. Lines of poetry recovered. New verses of the Epic of Gilgamesh have been recovered in this century. In 2011, a Kurdish museum in Suleymaniye acquired a tablet, bought, controversially, from a smuggler, that turned out to contain 20 previously unknown lines of the Cedar Forest episode, including a description of the forest full of birdsong and monkeys crying out. 4,000 years later, and the poem is still getting longer, and the 100th thing is what all of this was for. Underneath the gods and the floods and the assemblies, the Anunnaki were an answer to an unbearable question. Why is life like this? Why is the work so hard, and the river so unpredictable, and the child taken, and the city burned? These were people living on a flat plain between two rivers that could flood without warning and destroy everything in a night. They had no idea when the water would come. They could do everything right and lose it all. So they built a story in which those events were decisions, made in a room, by an assembly that could, at least in principle, be petitioned, appeased, argued with, wept at. A world where the flood is a verdict is a frightening world, but it is not a meaningless one. And meaning, when you're standing in the ruins of your house, may be the only thing available. That's what the Anunnaki were, not astronauts. Something stranger and much more moving. The first great attempt in writing to make the universe answerable. That's the 100. And if you're still with me, there's no rush now. The counting is done. and what's left is just texture. A few things that didn't fit anywhere, and that I don't want to leave out, because they're the details that make these people real rather than theoretical. Let them go by slowly. You don't need to keep track of anything anymore. Here's one. We know a startling amount about what it was like to go to school in Sumer, because the schoolwork survived. Scribal training happened in a place called the Aduba, the tablet house, and students learned by copying. Sign lists, word lists, proverbs, then literature. And because clay was reusable while wet and cheap when dry, thousands of student exercise tablets have been dug up, often in the actual houses where the teaching happened. There's a text scholars call School Days, and it's essentially a schoolboy's account of a bad day. He arrives late. He's caned for it. He's caned for talking without permission, for standing up without permission, for sloppy handwriting, for speaking Akkadian instead of Sumerian in class. Eventually, his father invites the teacher home for dinner, seats him in the place of honor, pours him good beer, gives him a new garment and a ring, and the teacher, warmed and gifted, begins to praise the boy extravagantly. 4,000 years ago, a parent bribed a teacher over dinner, and someone wrote it down as a comedy. Human beings have not changed as much as we like to think. Here's another. The Proverbs. Sumerian proverb collections are one of the most delightful things in the whole corpus, because they're so completely unpretentious. There's one that goes, roughly, a restless woman in the house adds ache to ache. There's one about how you can have a lord, you can have a king, but the man to fear is the tax collector. There's one that says, he who eats too much will not sleep. There's a wonderfully weary one that says, in effect, we are doomed to die, so let us spend. We will live long, so let us save. And there's one about a fox who urinated into the sea and then announced that the whole ocean was his creation. I think about that fox often. Here's another. Beer. Beer was central. It was safer than river water. It was part of workers' rations. And there's a hymn to Ninkasi, the goddess of brewing, that doubles as a recipe. It describes the baking of the bapir, the beer bread, the soaking, the mixing with sweet aromatics, the fermentation vat, the sound of the filtering vat which the poem compares to the rush of the Tigris and Euphrates. It was probably sung as a mnemonic. You brewed by singing, and people drank it through long straws, often communally from a single large jar, which you can see depicted on seals and plaques, two figures leaning in over a vessel with reeds in their mouths. The straw wasn't an affectation. Their beer had solids floating in it. You drank from below the surface. Here's another. Medicine. There are hundreds of medical tablets, and they show two parallel traditions working side by side. The Ashipu, the exorcist, who diagnosed the supernatural cause of an illness and dealt with the spirit or the god responsible, and the Asu, who ground herbs and made poultices and bandaged wounds. They were not rivals in the way you'd expect. They were often called in together on the same patient, doing different jobs. And there is a genuinely remarkable diagnostic series, sometimes called by its opening words, in which a physician is told to observe the patient's symptoms in a defined sequence and derive both a diagnosis and a prognosis, including, sometimes, the plain statement that the patient will die. Not every ancient medical system permitted that admission. Here's another. Dreams. The Mesopotamians took dreams extremely seriously, and there are dream omen collections that read like a very long, very strange index. If a man dreams he is flying, then this. If he dreams he eats a raven, then that. There were dream interpreters, often women. And there was a ritual for a nightmare that I find quietly wonderful. You could tell your bad dream to a lump of clay, and then dissolve the clay in water, and the dream would go with it. Say the thing out loud. Give it to something soft. Let the water take it. That's 4,000 years old. And honestly, as a technique, I'm not sure we've improved on it. Here's another. Music. We have the instruments, the lyres from the royal cemetery at Ur, with their bulls' heads of gold and lapis. And we have, from Ugarit on the Syrian coast, a set of clay tablets from around 1400 BCE that contain a hymn together with what appear to be musical instructions, interval names and numbers written beneath the words. Scholars call it Hurrian Hymn number 6, and it's the oldest, substantially complete piece of notated music we have found anywhere in the world. Now, exactly how it should sound is genuinely disputed. There are several competing reconstructions, and they sound quite different from each other. But you can go and listen to them. Somewhere in that argument is a melody that a person hummed while walking 3,500 years ago in a city on the Mediterranean coast. Here's another. Letters. Ordinary people wrote letters, and the letters survive, and they're wonderful. There's a famous one from a place called Kanesh, an Assyrian trading colony in Anatolia, in which merchants' wives write to their husbands about the textile business, complaining about instructions, defending their prices, asking for silver. Women running the manufacturing end of a long-distance trade network in the 19th century BCE, negotiating in writing. And there's the one everybody loves, from around 1750 BCE, a complaint tablet from a man named Nani to a copper merchant called Ea Nasir, in which Nani furiously details that the copper delivered was of inferior quality, that his messenger was treated with contempt, that this is not how one treats a gentleman. It has become, in our century, an internet joke. But when you strip the joke away, what you have is an angry customer in Ur, writing to a supplier, complaining about the goods, and being so angry that Ea Nasir apparently kept the letter in his house, where it sat until an archaeologist found it. We don't know why he kept it. Maybe for legal reasons, maybe out of spite. Either way, the most famous customer complaint in history is nearly 4,000 years old, and the man it was addressed to is now known worldwide, by name, entirely for being bad at his job. Here's another. The Anunnaki outlived their own religion in strange ways. Elements of Mesopotamian tradition were absorbed and carried forward into Aramaic magic bowls, into astrological practice, into the enormous body of Babylonian celestial omen literature that fed into later astronomy. The Greeks got Babylonian mathematics and Babylonian planetary records. The zodiac itself, the division of the ecliptic into 12 equal signs, appears to have been standardized by Babylonian astronomers in the second half of the first millennium BCE. So when someone tells you their star sign tonight, there's a thread running back from that sentence, unbroken, to a scribe on a temple roof in Babylon with a tablet on his knee, writing down where Venus was. Here's another, and it's a sad one. The places we've been talking about are under real pressure. The looting of the Iraq Museum in Baghdad in April 2003 was only the visible part. Across southern Iraq, unguarded sites were dug into on an industrial scale, with satellite photographs showing whole landscapes pockmarked with pits. tablets stripped out of the ground with no record of where they came from lose most of their meaning. A tablet without a context is a sentence without a paragraph. Later, further north, deliberate destruction was carried out at Nimrud and at the museum in Mosul, filmed and published as propaganda. And alongside that, there have been real recoveries. Thousands of objects returned to Iraq, including a fragment of Gilgamesh that had traveled through the antiquities market and was repatriated in 2021. The plain of Sumer is also drying. The marshes at the head of the Gulf, drained deliberately in the 1990s and partially restored afterward, are under severe stress again from drought and upstream dams. The marsh Arabs who live there have a way of building great arched halls out of bundled reeds, structures called mudhif, and the shape of those reed buildings appears on Sumerian carvings from 5,000 years ago. Same reeds, same silhouette, still standing for now. And here's the last one. The Anunnaki did not stay in the museums. They're in video games and television and comic books and 100,000 videos with dramatic thumbnails. They've been claimed by conspiracy theory and by science fiction, and occasionally by people who genuinely believe they're due back any day now. And I have a small, unfashionable thought about that, which I'll leave with you as we start to slow down properly. There's a real sense in which the ancient astronaut version, wrong as it is a compliment. It exists because people read these stories and felt their power and could not accept that they were merely fiction. They felt the weight of them, the strike, the clay, the flood, the woman hanging on the hook, and thought, that's too vivid to be invented. Something real must be behind it, and something real is behind it, just not a spaceship. What's behind it is a people who looked at a hard, dangerous, beautiful world and made literature out of it before anybody had ever done such a thing before. There was no tradition to follow, no genre, no earlier author to imitate. Whoever first sat down and wrote the line about the reed wall, or the eyes of death, or the gods cowering like dogs, they were doing something nobody had ever done. That's the actual miracle in this story. And it doesn't require a single visitor from anywhere. There are a few more voices I want you to hear before we finish, and they're the quiet ones. Stay with me, or don't. Either is fine. There's a man called Gudea who ruled the city-state of Lagash around 2100 BCE, and he left us 2 enormous clay cylinders covered in the longest continuous piece of Sumerian literature we possess. It's not a war record. It's an account of building a temple, and it begins with a dream. Gudea dreams of a giant man with wings, whose lower body ends in a flood wave, with lions crouching at either side of him. And the figure commands him to build a house. Gudea wakes up baffled. He says he doesn't understand what he's been told, and he goes by boat to consult a goddess who interprets dreams, and she explains it to him, piece by piece, like a good analyst. The giant was the god Ningirsu. The instruction was architectural, so he builds, and the text describes it in loving, granular detail. The purification of the city, the silence imposed while the work went on, the first brick pressed in the mold, the raising of the walls, the timber brought from the mountains, the stones hauled from far away, the celebration when it was finished and the god moved in. Sit with that. Of all the things a Bronze Age ruler could choose to make permanent, battles won, enemies broken, he chose the story of a construction project and the dream that started it. There are statues of Gudea in museums today, carved in hard, dark diorite, seated with his hands folded, and on his lap several of them carry an architect's plan. He's holding the blueprint. 4,000 years later, he's still holding it. Then, there's the Eridu Genesis, which is the Sumerian version of the flood, older in language than the Akkadian ones, and badly broken. We have perhaps a third of the tablet. In this version, the survivor is called Ziusudra, and his name means something close to life of long days. He's a king, and he's pious, and he stands by a wall when a voice comes to him, and he's told to build. And at the end of that fragment, the surviving gods do something they don't do in the Akkadian versions. They give Ziusudra eternal life, and they settle him in a place called Dilmun, a paradise land, associated with the island of Bahrain, described in another poem as a place where the raven does not croak, where the lion does not kill, where the sick-eyed does not say, "I am sick-eyed," where the old woman does not say, "I am an old woman," a country where nobody says they're old. That's how they imagined paradise. Not palaces, just the absence of the sentence. And there's a small, remarkable postscript to all of this. Around 280 BCE, long after Babylon had been absorbed into the Greek-speaking world following Alexander, a Babylonian priest called Berossus wrote a history of his own country in Greek for a Hellenistic king. He was trying to explain his civilization to the newcomers who now ruled it, in their language. His book is lost, but fragments of it survive, because later authors quoted him, and those quotations were quoted again, so what we have is a copy of a summary. And in those fragments he tells the flood story, with a king he calls Sisuthros, which is a Greek rendering of Ziusudra, and the ark, and the birds sent out. He also tells of a creature called Oans who came out of the sea. Along the top and sides are carved the symbols of the gods, the crescent for the moon, the disk for the sun, the star for Ishtar, the spade for Marduk, the horned crown for Anu and Enlil, and at the bottom, the curses. Long, elaborate, specific curses on anyone who moves the stone, erases the writing, or throws it in the water. That his boundary be taken from him, that his descendants be scattered, that the great gods, the Anunnaki, look on him with anger and destroy his foundations. Think about what a boundary stone is. It's an ordinary person's attempt to make a claim outlast their own lifetime. There's no state that will exist forever, no court that will still be sitting in 300 years. So you carve the gods across the top of your deed, and you hope. And the odd, quiet victory in it is that the stones worked, in a sense, not because the curses had force, but because the stone lasted. And here we are, reading the name of a man who owned a field in Babylonia 3,000 years ago, and the size of it, and who his neighbors were. There's one more thing I want to give you, and then we'll wind down. Among the tablets, there's a genre modern scholars sometimes call wisdom literature, and one of its best-known pieces is a poem often titled, from its first line, "I will praise the Lord of Wisdom," the Ludlul Bel Nemeki. It's the account of a man named Shupshi-Meshre-Shakan, who has done everything right and lost everything anyway. He describes it in detail. His god has abandoned him. His goddess has gone. His protective spirits have stepped aside. His friends avoid him. His family treats him as a stranger. He's covered in disease. He says that he prayed and made offerings and taught his household to revere the gods, and it made no difference at all. And then he says something extraordinary. that what seems good to a man is an offense to his God, and what a man despises in his own heart may be good to his God. Who, he asks, can understand the will of the gods in heaven? And then, in the end, he's healed. In a sequence of dreams, figures come to him, and he's restored, and he walks through the gates of Marduk's temple one by one, and there's a list of them, and each gate is a stage in his recovery. Scholars have compared this to the book of Job for a century and a half, and the comparison is fair. The same problem, the same refusal of easy answers, written down in Babylon centuries before Job was composed. But here is the thing I want to leave with you about it. The man in that poem is not comforted by an explanation. He never gets one. What he gets is an ending. The suffering stops, and he walks back in through the gates, and he's alive. Whatever it meant, it passed. Sometimes that's the whole of what's available, and they knew that 4,000 years ago, on the mud plain, under the same sky. So let's let all of it settle now. Think about the shape of the thing we've walked through tonight. A flat plain between two rivers. Mud, water, reeds. A group of people with almost nothing hard or permanent to build with, who invented the technology of memory itself because somebody needed to count sacks of barley. And then, having invented it, used it, within a few centuries, to write poems about grief and justice and the sea, and the terrible noise of too many people, and what it feels like to be dead. They imagined a council of gods sitting in a courtyard, deciding what would happen. They called them the children of heaven, and they gave them the only politics they knew: argument, delegation, negotiation, bad decisions taken while drunk, regret afterward. Gods who go on strike. Gods who weep at what they've done. Gods who find loopholes in their own oaths because they can't quite bear to let the world end. And then it all stopped. The language died. The script died. The cities emptied. The mounds rose over them, and for 1,800 years nobody on earth knew any of it had happened. Every name we said tonight, Enlil, Enki, Inana, Ereshkigal, Atrahasis, and Heduanna, was gone, completely. Not a rumor, not a legend. Erased. And then a soldier climbed a cliff in Iran with a notebook. And an Assyrian man from Mosul dug at night into a mound above a river and found rooms full of clay. And a banknote engraver from Chelsea, who left school at 14, spent his lunch breaks in a museum until somebody let him touch the fragments. And one afternoon, he turned a broken piece over and read about a dove sent out from a boat. All of it came back. Not because it was meant to, or protected or preserved by anyone's design. It came back because a city burned and the fire hardened the tablets, and because a few stubborn people spent their lives on it, and because clay is patient. That's a strange kind of comfort when you think about it. Nothing about that recovery was inevitable. It very nearly didn't happen. And yet here we are, tonight, thousands of miles and thousands of years away, and you know that a scribe called Ku-aya copied out a poem as a student exercise and signed his name at the bottom, and because he did, you know how the Babylonians thought the world began. He had no idea. He was just finishing his homework. Maybe that's the thought to fall asleep on. That the things we do carefully and without ceremony, the ordinary work, the small acts of attention, the writing down of something so it isn't lost, those can travel much further than we'd ever guess. Not because we're grand, but because sometimes the clay survives. You don't need to hold on to any of this. Not the names, not the numbers, Not the flood or the 7 gates or the 600 gods divided between heaven and earth. Let it all go loose. If you remember one thing tomorrow, let it be whichever thing floated up on its own. That's usually the one that was meant for you anyway. Somewhere out there tonight, under the sand of southern Iraq, there are tablets nobody has read yet, sitting in the dark, exactly as they were left. Someone's letter, someone's receipt, someone's poem about the sea. They're not going anywhere. They've waited this long. Let your breathing slow. Let the plane go quiet, and the rivers run on in the dark, and the little tower of brick stand there under the stars with nobody on it. There's nothing left to decide tonight. The assembly has adjourned. Sleep well,